But the sort of last question I wanted to, ask you, KJ, going back to the sort of broad international situation provoked by the, American aggression or American and Israeli aggression in the Gulf, is, if America fails to, do the right thing and sort of stand down, it does present a dilemma for the world. I've been watching here from the remote South Pacific as Venezuela's happened and Iran's happened and Greenland threats have happened, and the United States really does seem to have gone rogue, and not just in its actions but in its statements as well. Openly defied and mocked international law and the United Nations, etc. And so the question arises, well, what do countries like China, Russia, and other supporters of the UN multilateral system do in this regard? And perhaps China, given it's so powerful economically, I guess. There's a debate, on the sort of YouTube sort of rounds, geopolitics rounds, about whether China should do more. And I know you've said before, it's like someone faced with a drunk in a bar, sort of threatening to punch everyone, and you've kind of got to calm the guy down. But I do wonder at times whether the United States has become rather more menacing than just a drunk in the bar, and maybe something a little bit more restraining needs to happen with the United States. What's your sense of how China and the other major states, I guess, in the UN system, because it's not China's responsibility alone, it's all the members of the UN Security Council at a minimum. But what's your sense of, how it's responding to this? And, is it enough? Is it just a question of patience and forbearance? What's your sense of it?
The time is not on the side of the empire. And I think it would be foolish for more countries to pile into this war on any side. I think that, I don't think there are any good solutions that will come out of further escalation or further expanding the war. In some sense, we're already in the beginnings of a global war, World War III. We can debate whether it started with Ukraine, whether it started with in the Middle East, even before then. But certainly this is a considerable turning point. The thing to understand is the US has been at war 96% of its existence, right? 234 years out of 250 years. China has been at peace for 94% of its existence. It has had just a little bit over 3 years of war over a period of 77 years since its founding. It had, a 3-year war in Korea and then a 3-week war in Vietnam. As a point of contrast, the US was at war for 15 years in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. So, the US is at war everywhere all the time, and it wants more wars. It's an arsonist setting fires everywhere. And I don't think the solution is to set counter fires. I don't think that leads to anything that improves the global situation, certainly doesn't improve, the global international humanitarian law. And if, for example, in the case of China, if, as people seem to urge it, if China were to try and play firefighter to all the fires that the US is setting everywhere, and it's an arsonist setting fires everywhere, it would very rapidly, I believe, die from exhaustion and smoke inhalation. So if China had binding military alliances with all its allies, it would constantly end up at war because that is what the US strategy is, to draw it into constant bruising and attritive battle rather than to allow it to grow and develop. And what China is doing, I've said this before, it's almost trite, but China is playing the game of Go. In the game of Go, you connect in order to live. The US is playing the game of chess. You position in order to kill. So China's strategy is different. You build the connective tissue that will help it and the global South thrive, and you do not meet the US where it is the most powerful, which is in attritive, strategic, and tactical kinetic war. I think that's a bad idea. But let's think about specifically what China is doing to support Iran. Iran has a 25-year comprehensive strategic agreement with Iran. It has officially welcomed Iran into BRICS and the Belt and Road. It's part of the SCO. And so this is translated concretely into, first, China's Huawei helped build out Iran's digital infrastructure, both its hardware and its software platforms, to resist Western intervention and subversion. That helps secure digital sovereignty, and that helps it resist the information warfare and the subversion, which is the pre-kinetic and the subkinetic dimension of US war against Iran. The US has a digital Wolfowitz doctrine, and it always starts and maintains its war with information warfare. And Iran, by building out its digital sovereignty, actually has a real chance of resisting US attempts at regime change and decapitation. The second thing is, there's the economic lifeline. So China's continued trade, sanctions resistance, supply chain continuity. It has helped to build out the China-Iran railway, which is unaffected by sea lane blockade. Prior to the war, we know that they were supplying dual use and direct military use hardware, supplies, and parts. And the Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson actually said this, essentially, are you helping Iran military? And she said, we are helping Iran maintain its sovereignty against an illegal war, which is another way of saying yes. But they supplied 1 or possibly 2,000 tons of sodium perchlorate, which is the precursor for solid fuel rockets. We know that they've provided ISR and hardware, including the Beidou 3 system. This is the GPS system, which can be used for navigation and targeting. It also includes a short message system that allows secure communication. And then it may have provided access to 500 remote sensing satellites that provide up-to-date signals intelligence and terrain surveillance. So this permits the tracking of US movements and, again, supports the targeting. It's also said that it had provided YLC-8B radars. These are the radars that are supposed to negate US stealth advantages. And if Iran's claim that they shot down a stealth fighter, the F-35, is true, then this might have been related to the provision of these stealth negating radars. And then it's also said that they may be in negotiation for CM-302 carrier killer supersonic missiles. Regardless of whether that's the case or not, both the USS Ford and the USS Abraham Lincoln are out of theater. Ford seems to be permanently disabled. It is in for at least 12 months of maintenance. But they moved rapidly out of theater, and it seems like the US does not seem to be projecting force with aircraft carriers because it's too dangerous. And then, as you know, the THAAD missile batteries were taken down. These are multi-billion dollars worth strategic assets. And it has kind of disabled the US's panopticon over transparent theater of war. The US has always had like this vast panopticon over the theater of war. That's what it relies on. If you go to every US military base, every major military US base, there's sometimes one or two golfing greens. And essentially, you get on the green and you don't sweat too much. You ride your cart, and then you have this vast vista where you can knock the ball anywhere you want to. That has been the US experience of a major war, that it has, these kind of vast vistas in which it can send and lob balls or lob weaponry, missiles at will. And that is no longer the case. And I believe that a lot of this has to do with China's support, China and Russia's support. And not to discount it, but what China is doing is building BRICS. Now, BRICS is not a military alliance, but I always argue that there is a real strength to weak ties. So they have multiple orientations and interests and systems, but it's a kind of cohesion which is different from your traditional military alliance, but still gives it strength. And I have compared it to water. Water is soft, malleable, fits all shapes and situations, and yet the hydrogen bonds of water give it an incredible connected, coordinated power that both parts and disperses when it's directly impacted, but gives it the kind of resilient, elastic power to resist and to hit back over and over again. So I consider it to be, in Chinese, they have this word called jing, which is the elastic, resilient power of sinew and connective tissue. And that is much, much more endurable than that of muscular force. Muscle exhausts, but connective tissue never tires. And it gains its strength from its elastic force that comes from alignment. It actually gains power for being stressed and pulled. And so, these are things like the Global Security Initiative, Global Development Initiative, Global Civilizational Initiative. These things, I think, build the connective tissue along the global south that allow it to challenge colonialism and neocolonialism over a long haul. And in the short term, it doesn't look like it is fighting back. But inside, I believe there's a much, much deeper and more powerful strategy of resilience, which is happening, that I think the West is not aware of. We do know that decolonization is incomplete. So there was flag independence that was granted to some former colonies, but Western colonial powers never allowed the world to decolonize. They control the sea lanes, they control the ocean corridors, the energy system, the financial architecture, as well as the systems of the production of knowledge and the institutions of legitimation and delegitimation, namely, the UN and other related systems. So this is a long haul, this is a long struggle, and countries of the global south have to fight for their full decolonization. The struggle has to continue, but it has to take multiple forms because neocolonial control exists in multiple domains. And so the resistance also has to happen on all across the board. It has to be a full spectrum resistance. The last thing I'll say is, you mentioned Adam Tooze, and his reading of the global financial elite. If we, kind of get back down to the nuts and bolts of the contradictions that the imperial powers are facing, they have to do with the contradictions of monopoly capital and its financialization. And the other dimension of this is that what happens with markets is markets need good information in order to function competitively and efficiently. But what happens inside the market is information itself is commoditized and becomes part of the market itself. And so there is no Archimedean perspective or Archimedean viewpoint from which you can observe the system and make good decisions. So the system is kind of self-swallowing. It's a self-licking ice cream. It kind of recursively re-embeds its contradictions into itself. There's no way out of that. And so those are the core contradictions that we're facing. So, when Tu says that, there are catastrophic consequences, but nobody has a good model or a real model, what we're really describing are the contradictions of capital itself. And so there is a solution, there is a way out, and that involves dismantling the systems of capital and finding an alternate path, such as is being pioneered by the sovereign socialisms of the global south, of which China is a notable example. I think that's where hope lies. That's where possibility lies. Otherwise, we are doomed to continual war, continual immiseration, and further, societal conflict and collapse.
Indeed. And I guess ultimately, the United States is going to have to face the moral responsibility for what it has done as well. I sometimes like to think, there's this famous book about Japan after World War II called Embracing Defeat. And regardless of the pros and cons of the argument for that, I just think it's a wonderful metaphor of perhaps what the United States needs to do. It doesn't need to just experience a strategic defeat or get an off-ramp or find an excuse or blame Israel. It needs to sort of embrace defeat and therefore embrace a different role in this sort of more connected, different kind of world that you've just so beautifully described, KJ. Thank you again, KJ. You're a unique and wonderful voice in this little mini world of commentary on geopolitics on YouTube. I really deeply appreciate your perspective, both different regions that you speak about, but also the broad-ranging social, cultural, military, political sort of perspective you bring to things. So thank you ever so much for joining me today. Is there anything you'd like to, any sort of work or channel of yours that you want to just briefly mention to viewers before we sign off?
Yeah, I'd like to do a shameless self-promotion.
Yes, good.
That I wrote with Finian Cunningham and Dan Kovalik and Jeremy Kuzmarov and Ron Ridenour. And it's about the current state of affairs. There's a significant chapter on Iran and Venezuela. And it's about, the propaganda system and the degradation of human society and culture from that, and politics from that propaganda system, and some optimistic suggestions as to what we can do to try and change the outcome. What we want to make sure is that the world does not end either with a bang or a whimper, and that there are possibilities and there are actually things that we all can do. Partly it starts with being well-informed and exercising critical judgment, and then finding other people with whom to take concerted action.
Indeed. Excellent. So I'll include links to that book in the video description below. And thank you so much, KJ, for joining me today.
Thank you, Jeff. Always a pleasure.